Get rid of it. I don't want a child, said the Millionaire CEO. 3 years later, he saw her with triplets and couldn't move. Hi, my beautiful family. May the Almighty clothe every woman in peace that no storm can steal, strength that never bows, and grace that never fades. May your hands never grow weary of doing good, and may every scar become proof of the battles you've conquered. You are the dawn after a long night, the prayer that never gives up, and the love that never runs dry. May your heart stay whole, your faith unbroken, and your light forever unshaken. My precious family, remember, your courage is someone else's miracle. A like is a prayer whispered. A comment is a bond renewed in faith. This is mission 1,000 likes for every woman who rose after being broken, who smiled through pain, who still believes in love. If your heart beats with hope, like this video, if your soul walks in faith, comment, I'm with Mr. Peter. The check landed on the glass table between them like a death sentence. 6 zeros that were supposed to erase 3 months of promises and a future that would never exist. Sandra Astilla's hands trembled as she stared at the piece of paper, her reflection distorted in the polished surface beneath it. The penthouse office felt like a cage now, all that glass and steel and expensive leather suddenly suffocating. She had rehearsed this moment in the mirror for 3 days, practicing different ways to tell him, imagining his surprise melting into joy, maybe even tears. Instead, Tony Nelson stood with his back to her, looking out at the city lights spread below like scattered diamonds, his silence more devastating than any words. This solves everything. His voice was flat, corporate, the same tone he used in board meetings when discussing quarterly losses. The money covers the procedure, relocation expenses, and enough for you to start fresh somewhere else. Somewhere far from here. Sandra pressed her palm against her stomach, still flat, but holding 3 lives she didn't even know about yet. I thought you would want to know. I thought after everything we talked about, all those nights when you said you were tired of living for everyone else, that maybe this could be different. Tony turned then, and his face was a stranger's face. Gone was the man who traced her jawline in the darkness and whispered about escape, about freedom, about building something real. This was the heir to Nelson Industries, the son who had been groomed since childhood to value legacy over love, profit over people. You thought wrong. He moved to his desk, straightening papers that didn't need straightening, his movements precise and controlled. I have responsibilities, Sandra. My father's health is failing. The merger with Ashford Banking depends on my engagement to Vivian. The board expects stability, not scandal. Scandal, Sandra repeated the word like it tasted of poison. That's what this is to you. That's what I am. Don't make this emotional. Tony's jaw tightened. We were always clear about what this was. I never promised you anything permanent. The lie hung in the air between them, so obvious that Sandra almost laughed. She remembered every promise, every whispered confession, every moment he pretended to be someone capable of choosing love over duty. For 8 months she had believed the performance, had mistaken his temporary rebellion for permanent transformation. You told me you loved me. Her voice cracked on the word, hating herself for the weakness. 2 weeks ago in that hotel room, you said you couldn't imagine your life without me. I said what you needed to hear. Tony's words were surgical, designed to cut clean. You're beautiful, Sandra. You made me feel alive for a while, but this was never going to end any other way. I'm marrying Vivian in 6 months. The contracts are signed. The announcements are scheduled. This child would complicate everything. This child. Sandra stood, her legs barely supporting her weight. You keep saying this like it's an object, a problem to be managed. There's a heartbeat inside me, Tony. There's life. There's a complication. He picked up the check, holding it out to her like a business transaction. Take the money. End this before it becomes something neither of us can handle. You're young, Sandra. You have your whole life ahead of you. Don't throw it away on a mistake. The cruelty of his dismissal finally penetrated through her shock, igniting something fierce in her chest. Sandra looked at this man she had loved, really looked at him, and saw the truth she had been avoiding. He had never been hers. He had never been real. Everything between them had been borrowed time, stolen moments, a fantasy she had confused with reality. "I'm not doing this for you." She left the check on the table, her voice steady now. "Whatever happens next, it's my choice, my life, my future." Tony's expression flickered, something almost like regret crossing his features before the mask settled back into place. "You have 2 days to reconsider. After that, I'll have my lawyers contact you with a formal agreement. Take the help, Sandra. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. The only thing hard here is understanding how I ever thought you were capable of loving anyone." Sandra grabbed her purse, her movements deliberate despite the chaos screaming inside her skull. "You're going to regret this, Tony. Not because I'll make you pay, but because one day you'll wake up and realize you traded everything real for a life that was always a lie. Get out." His voice was cold now, all pretense of civility abandoned. "Get out before I call security." Sandra walked to the elevator on legs that felt disconnected from her body, her heels clicking against marble floors that had once seemed magical, back when she was foolish enough to believe fairy tales. The doors closed on Tony's silhouette, still standing at that window, still choosing the city over her, still proving that some men were raised to destroy rather than build. The lobby was empty at this hour, just the night security guard who nodded at her politely, unaware that her entire world had just shattered 40 stories above his head. Sandra pushed through the revolving doors into the night air, rain beginning to fall in sheets, soaking through her coat before she had taken 3 steps. She walked for blocks, maybe miles, barely aware of direction or destination, her mind replaying every moment, every lie, every promise that had been calculated manipulation. The pregnancy test in her purse felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. This tiny piece of plastic that had revealed not just new life, but the truth about the man she had loved. Finally, Sandra stopped on a corner, rain plastering her hair to her face, mascara running in dark rivers down her cheeks. She pressed both hands against her stomach, feeling nothing yet, but knowing everything was different now. Tony had given her a choice, thinking he was being generous, thinking his money could erase consequences. But Sandra had already made her choice the moment she saw those 2 pink lines. She chose life over convenience. She chose love over money. She chose the unknown over the easy lie. "We're going to survive this," she whispered to the life growing inside her, her voice fierce despite the tears. "I don't know how, but we will. And one day he's going to see what he threw away, and it will destroy him." The rain fell harder, washing away the last traces of the woman who had walked into that penthouse office, leaving someone new, someone stronger, someone who understood that the hardest choices were often the only real ones. Chapter 2. The Vanishing. Sandra disappeared the way smoke disappears, gradually and then all at once, leaving behind everything that connected her to Tony Nelson's world. The luxury apartment he paid for sat empty, her key left on the counter with no note, no forwarding address, just absence. Her job at the gallery ended with a brief email resignation, professional and cold, giving them nothing to question or follow up on. Friends who knew her as Tony's girlfriend found her number disconnected, her social media accounts deleted, her entire digital footprint erased like she had never existed. The bus ride to her aunt's house took 8 hours, winding through landscapes that transformed from urban sprawl to rural beauty, each mile putting distance between her and the life that had imploded. Sandra pressed her forehead against the window, watching towns blur past, feeling like she was shedding a skin, becoming someone new out of necessity. Her phone buzzed repeatedly during the first hour, Tony's name flashing across the screen until she finally turned it off and dropped it into a trash can at a rest stop. Whatever he wanted to say now, whatever excuses or threats or final payments he wanted to offer, she didn't want to hear them. Rosalind's house appeared exactly as Sandra remembered from childhood visits. A small cottage 3 blocks from the ocean, weathered blue paint, and a garden that grew wild with herbs and flowers. Her aunt stood on the porch before Sandra even knocked, as if some instinct had warned her that family was coming home broken and in need of shelter. "Child, get in here before you collapse." Rosalind pulled Sandra inside, her hands strong and warm, smelling like the lavender she grew in clay pots. "You look like death warmed over." Sandra meant to explain, to find words that would make sense of the catastrophe, but instead she crumbled, her body folding into her aunt's arms, sobs tearing through her chest like they would split her open. Rosalind held her through it, making soft humming sounds, the same sounds she had made when Sandra was small and her father left, and the world first taught her that men could abandon the people they claimed to love. The guest room became Sandra's sanctuary, a small space with yellowing wallpaper and a bed that creaked, but felt safer than anywhere she had slept in months. That first night, lying in darkness with ocean sounds drifting through the open window, Sandra let herself feel the full weight of what had happened. Tony's betrayal wasn't just about the pregnancy. It was about discovering that the person she loved had never actually existed. That every moment of intimacy had been theater, that she had been so desperate to believe in love that she had ignored every warning sign. The first doctor's appointment revealed the truth that would reshape everything. Sandra lay on the examination table, gel cold on her stomach, watching the ultrasound screen with detached curiosity. The technician's face changed, her expression shifting from routine to surprised, and Sandra's heart dropped. "Is something wrong?" Her voice came out small, terrified. "Wrong. No, honey, everything's perfect." The technician turned the screen, pointing to 3 distinct shapes, 3 separate heartbeats pulsing in rhythm. "You're having triplets. 3 healthy babies, all developing beautifully." Sandra stared at the screen, unable to process what she was seeing. 3 lives, 3 futures, 3 souls that Tony had wanted her to erase with a check and a cold command. The magnitude of it crashed over her, not just the practical impossibility of raising 3 children alone, but the cosmic joke of it all. Of course, her body would do something extraordinary. Of course, nothing about this would be simple or easy or anything like she expected. "Are you okay?" The technician's voice was gentle, concerned. "I know triplets can be overwhelming news." "I'm okay," Sandra heard herself say, though she had no idea if it was true. "I'm going to be okay." The pregnancy was brutal in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her body stretched and ached, exhaustion settling into her bones like permanent weight. Morning sickness lasted all day, every day for months. Simple tasks like climbing stairs or putting on shoes became monumental efforts. Rosalind worked double shifts at the hospital, coming home exhausted, but always ready to help Sandra through another crisis, another panic attack. Another moment when the impossibility of everything threatened to drown her. Sandra enrolled in online classes for graphic design, determined to build skills that could support her family, to become someone who didn't need rescue or charity or handouts. Late at night, when the babies kicked and rolled inside her, she worked on assignments, teaching herself programs and techniques, building a portfolio from nothing. The work gave her purpose beyond survival, reminded her that she was still capable of creating something beautiful even in the midst of chaos. She talked to them constantly, these 3 lives sharing her body, telling them stories about the ocean and her grandmother, who taught her that strength wasn't something you found, but something you decided to be. She never mentioned their father, as if silence could erase him from their story, though sometimes she woke from dreams where Tony was there. Watching her belly grow, his face twisted with regret. The labor came early, her body deciding that 7 months was long enough to carry 3. Sandra was terrified as they rushed her to the hospital, Rosalind holding her hand, talking her through contractions that felt like her body was tearing itself apart. The world blurred into pain and panic and bright lights, voices telling her to push, to breathe, to hold on just a little longer. Then the first cry pierced through everything, sharp and indignant and perfect. Then the second, softer but just as insistent. Then the third, a wail that sounded like fury at being forced into the cold world. They placed 3 tiny humans on Sandra's chest, warm and wet and impossibly real, and nothing else in the universe mattered anymore. "What are their names?" A nurse hovered nearby, clipboard ready. Sandra looked down at 3 perfect faces, 3 lives she had chosen, 3 souls that were hers to protect and love and raise. "Lorelei," she touched the first baby's dark curls. "Amélie," she whispered to the quiet one with serious eyes. "And Caspian," she smiled at the smallest, who was still crying like he had opinions about this whole situation. The first year passed in a blur of sleepless nights and constant needs. 3 infants with different temperaments requiring different approaches. Lorelei was demanding and loud, letting the world know immediately when she was unhappy. Amélie was watchful and calm, almost eerily self-sufficient. Caspian was sensitive and clingy, needing constant reassurance that he was safe and loved. Sandra learned to function on fragments of sleep, to feed 3 babies while barely conscious, to somehow keep everyone alive when she felt like she was dying herself. Rosalind became her lifeline, teaching her how to manage chaos, how to find moments of joy in the exhaustion, how to remember that this impossible situation was also a miracle. They developed routines, systems, ways to survive each day and then the next and then the next after that. Sandra's design business grew slowly, word of mouth bringing clients. Her work improving as she found her voice, her style, her unique perspective shaped by struggle. By their 3rd birthday, the triplets had become whole people with distinct personalities that filled every corner of her life. Lorelei was fierce and protective, always stepping between her siblings and anything that frightened them, her confidence sometimes terrifying. Amélie was quiet and observant, seeing things other children missed, her drawings already showing a talent that seemed to come from nowhere. Caspian was gentle and emotional, crying at sad stories, collecting treasures from the beach, giving hugs that felt like he wanted to merge souls. Sandra had built a life from destruction, had survived what should have destroyed her, had created beauty from betrayal. She rarely thought about Tony anymore, had trained herself to stop wondering if he ever regretted his choice, if he ever thought about what he had thrown away. The anger had cooled into something else, not forgiveness, but absence, an empty space where he used to live in her thoughts. Then the email arrived, an invitation to a major design conference in the city she had fled, an opportunity that could transform her small business into something real and sustainable. Sandra stared at the screen, her cursor hovering over the delete button, knowing that going back meant facing ghosts, risking the peace she had fought so hard to build. But she had 3 children who deserved more than survival, who deserved a mother chasing dreams instead of hiding from the past. Sandra hit accept on the invitation, her heart pounding with fear and determination, understanding that some confrontations were inevitable, that running forever wasn't the same as healing. Chapter 3. The Collision. The city had transformed in 3 years. Or perhaps Sandra was the one who had transformed, and the city was just different through her new eyes. She left the triplets with Rosalind, her first separation from them since birth, and the absence felt like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. Every instinct screamed to go back, to protect them from a world that felt too dangerous. But Rosalind had practically pushed her onto the bus, insisting that Sandra needed this, needed to remember who she was, beyond mother, beyond survivor. The hotel was in the arts district, deliberately chosen for its distance from the financial towers where Tony lived his separate life. Sandra unpacked in a room that felt too quiet, too empty, missing the chaos of 3 voices demanding her attention simultaneously. She had prepared for this conference like it was a battle, researching attendees, planning her approach, determined to find clients who could elevate her business beyond local shops and small contracts. The first day was overwhelming. Hundreds of designers competing for attention, everyone glossy and confident in ways that made Sandra feel like an imposter. But she pushed through the discomfort, forcing herself to network, to pitch, to pretend she belonged in these spaces. By the second day, she had found her rhythm, discovered that her work spoke for itself, that survival had given her a perspective most of these privileged artists could never access. Jasmine Park appeared like an answered prayer. A gallery owner from Seattle who stopped at Sandra's portfolio display and actually looked, really studied each piece instead of the polite glance most people offered. She was sharp and funny, her success story involving multiple failures before she finally broke through, and she told Sandra that talent was cheap, but perspective was priceless. And Sandra had both. "I need a complete rebrand." Jasmine pulled out her phone, showing Sandra her current logo, a generic design that said nothing about her gallery's mission. "I want something that captures resilience, beauty emerging from struggle, art as survival." "Can you do that?" Sandra's heart raced, recognizing the opportunity, the door opening. "I can do that." They talked for hours, the conversation evolving from business to personal, Jasmine sharing her own story of building something from nothing, of refusing to let failure define her. By the time they parted, Sandra had a contract that would pay more than she had earned in the entire previous year. Validation that she was actually good at this, that she could build a career and not just survive. Walking back to her hotel that evening, Sandra felt something shift inside her, a recognition that she had not just survived, but was beginning to thrive. The street was crowded with people heading to restaurants and bars, the city alive with possibility, and she was so lost in thought that she didn't notice the commotion ahead until she was almost through it. Cameras flashed, security guards created a perimeter, and then she heard his voice, that familiar cadence that still occasionally haunted her dreams. Tony Nelson stood outside an upscale restaurant, surrounded by men in expensive suits, their laughter sharp and exclusive, celebrating something that probably involved millions of dollars and decisions that affected thousands of lives. He looked older, harder, his hair touched with gray that somehow made him more distinguished instead of aging him. The suit he wore probably cost more than Sandra's rent, his watch catching light like a small sun on his wrist. This was his world, power and privilege and casual wealth. And Sandra was suddenly aware of her second-hand dress, her scuffed shoes, the distance between their universes. She should have kept walking, should have disappeared into the crowd before he noticed her, but something made her freeze. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the success still glowing in her chest from Jasmine's contract. Maybe it was just exhaustion from running. Their eyes met across 20 feet of crowded sidewalk, and Sandra watched recognition hit him like a physical blow. Tony's face drained of color, his hand gripping the doorframe for balance, his mouth opening but no sound emerging. The men around him continued talking, unaware of the earthquake happening in his head. And Sandra felt a savage satisfaction at his shock, his obvious distress. Proof that she had haunted him the way he had haunted her. For a moment, neither of them moved, caught in the gravity of their shared history. Sandra could see questions forming in his eyes, calculations about what to say, how to approach this, whether his friends were watching. Before he could speak, before he could shatter the peace she had worked so hard to build, Sandra turned and walked away. She didn't run, refused to give him that satisfaction, just moved with deliberate purpose. Her heels clicking against concrete, her spine straight, despite the panic flooding her system. One block, then another, then she turned a corner and collapsed against a building, gasping for air like she had been drowning. Her hands shaking so hard she had to press them against the brick to make them still. The conference ended the next day, and Sandra fled back to her aunt's house like a refugee escaping war. The triplets mobbed her the moment she walked through the door, their voices overlapping in demands for attention, stories tumbling out about their adventures with Aunt Rosalind. Sandra held them all at once, breathing in their familiar smell, feeling her heart settle back into its proper rhythm. "How was it?" Rosalind asked later, after the children were asleep. "Good, really good." Sandra pulled out the contract with Jasmine, proof that the trip had been worth the terror. "I saw him, though, Tony, just for a second." Rosalind's expression tightened. "Did he approach you?" "No, I walked away before he could." Sandra stared at the contract, feeling the accomplishment dim under the weight of that encounter. "I thought I was over it, Aunt Ro. I thought I had moved past all that anger and hurt. But seeing him brought it all back like it happened yesterday." "Healing isn't linear, baby." Rosalind squeezed her hand. "Sometimes old wounds reopen just to remind us they existed. Doesn't mean you haven't healed. Just means you're human." Sandra wanted to believe that, wanted to think the encounter was just a blip, meaningless in the context of her new life. But 2 weeks later, standing in the park while the triplets played on the swings, she felt eyes on her back with such intensity that her skin prickled with awareness. She turned slowly, already knowing what she would see. Tony stood by the playground entrance, staring at Lorelei and Amelie and Caspian with an expression she couldn't decipher. He had found her somehow, had tracked her down, had invaded the safe space she had built far from his reach. The children were laughing, completely oblivious to the man watching them, to the biological connection neither side acknowledged. Lorelei's hair caught the afternoon sun, dark curls bouncing as she pumped her legs on the swing. Amelie sat in the sand, drawing patterns with a stick, her concentration absolute. Caspian ran between them, his joy infectious, his innocence complete. Sandra watched Tony watching them, saw him do the math, count backwards to that night in the penthouse when he had tried to erase them with money and cold words. His face was a study in devastation, realization crashing over him in waves, understanding what he had lost, what he had thrown away, what he could never have back. Lorelei noticed her mother's sudden stillness and ran over, her small hand gripping Sandra's leg, her dark eyes suspicious of the stranger making her mother's face do scary things. "Who's that man, Mama?" "Nobody." Sandra's voice came out harder than she intended. "He's nobody important." Tony took a step forward, his mouth opening, and Sandra finally found her voice, sharp enough to cut. "Don't." The word stopped him cold. "Don't you dare come near them. Don't you dare think you have any right to look at them, to know them, to exist in their world. You made your choice 3 years ago. Live with it." She grabbed Lorelei's hand, called to Amelie and Caspian, and walked away from the park, from Tony, from the confrontation she wasn't ready to have. Behind her she could feel his presence, could imagine his face twisted with emotions he had no right to feel, could sense the beginning of something she had feared since the moment she chose to keep them. Tony Nelson had seen his children, and that changed everything, whether Sandra was ready for it or not. Chapter 4. The Unraveling. Tony Nelson sat in his office long after everyone else had gone home, the city lights below him blurring through tears he refused to acknowledge. The photographs spread across his desk should not exist, should never have been taken, but he had needed to know, needed visual confirmation of what he suspected the moment he saw Sandra in that crowd. 3 children, triplets, 2 girls and a boy. Their faces a perfect blend of Sandra's beauty and his own features. Undeniable proof that his attempt to erase them had failed spectacularly. Lorelei with his mother's determined chin. Amelie with his brother's artistic intensity. Caspian with the gentle smile Tony had lost somewhere between childhood and corporate warfare. The private investigator's report was thorough, clinical in its detail. Sandra Astilla, living with her aunt in a coastal town, running a small design business, raising 3 children alone on an income that barely covered necessities. No child support, no father listed on the birth certificates, no connection to the Nelson name except the DNA coursing through 3 small bodies that Tony had tried to wish out of existence. His marriage to Vivian Ashford had been exactly what was promised. A merger of fortunes wrapped in the pretense of romance. They maintained separate bedrooms, separate lives, coming together only for public appearances and business discussions. Vivienne focused on her art curation career, hosting charity events that enhanced their social standing, while Tony buried himself in work, expanding Nelson Industries across international markets, earning his father's grudging approval. They had no children, would never have children. An agreement made before the wedding that Tony had accepted with relief. Vivienne had no interest in motherhood. Her ambitions centered on building her own legacy, and Tony had convinced himself he was equally disinterested. Except now he knew that 3 children existed in the world, his children, growing up without him, and the emptiness he had always attributed to success suddenly had a name. The guilt was suffocating, not just for what he did to Sandra, but for what he had stolen from himself. 3 years of birthdays and first words and milestones he could never recover. 3 lives that didn't know his name, didn't know they had a father who lay awake at night staring at their photographs like a man possessed. His father would have told him to forget it, to let sleeping disasters lie, to protect the family name from scandal. But his father's opinion had been losing power over Tony's decisions for months now, ever since he realized that chasing legacy had cost him everything authentic in his life. The empire felt hollow, the success meaningless, every achievement tainted by the knowledge that he had sacrificed real love for corporate approval. Tony hired a lawyer, then fired her when she started talking about custody battles and parental rights, strategies that would destroy Sandra and traumatize the children he supposedly wanted to know. He tried to talk himself out of this obsession, to convince himself that showing up now would only cause damage, that he had forfeited every right when he told Sandra to get rid of it. But the voice in his head, insisting he deserved to know his children, was louder than reason, louder than conscience, louder than the warning signs flashing that this was about his needs and not their well-being. Tony couldn't see past his own sudden desire for fatherhood, couldn't examine why 3 years of indifference had transformed into desperate need, couldn't question whether disrupting their peace was cruel or just selfish. He drove to the coastal town without a plan, telling himself he just wanted to see where they lived, to understand their world, to somehow make sense of the life he had rejected. Sandra's rental house was small and weathered, a bicycle with training wheels on the porch, children's drawings taped to the windows, evidence of life and love and everything he had traded for cold success. Tony watched from his car as Sandra herded the triplets into a van, their voices loud and chaotic, her face tired but content in ways he had never achieved. She looked different, stronger, more herself than she had been during their relationship. Back then, she had been soft and eager to please, molding herself to fit his world. Now she moved with authority, completely comfortable in her role. A woman who had survived his betrayal and built something beautiful from the wreckage. He followed them to the park, staying at a distance, watching the children play with an intensity that probably looked disturbing. Lorelei was fearless on the swings, pushing herself higher than seemed safe, her laughter carrying across the playground. Emily sat apart, focused on her sand drawings, creating patterns that showed artistic talent beyond her age. Caspian bounced between his sisters, needing connection, seeking approval, his sensitivity obvious even from a distance. When Sandra's eyes met his across the playground, Tony felt the full weight of his choices crash down. The hatred in her face was pure and justified, and underneath it was fear, terror that he was there to take something else from her, to steal the children she had raised alone. Tony wanted to explain that he just wanted to know them, to be part of their lives, to somehow undo the devastation he had caused. But her command to stay away was absolute, her rejection complete. He stood there after they left, frozen in the spot where he had first seen his children up close, understanding that DNA didn't grant rights, that biology didn't erase abandonment, that he had destroyed any claim to fatherhood when he chose his empire over their existence. But Tony was his father's son in the worst ways. trained to fight for what he wanted, regardless of whether he deserved it. The voice telling him to walk away, to leave them in peace. To accept that some mistakes couldn't be fixed was drowned out by possessiveness and entitlement, and the arrogant belief that wanting something badly enough made it his. He called the lawyer back, asked about his options, his rights, his strategies for inserting himself into their lives. She warned him about optics, about judges who favored primary caregivers, about how his wealth might work against him in custody disputes. Tony listened but didn't hear, already planning his approach, already deciding that gradual infiltration would work better than legal warfare. That night, lying in his separate bedroom while Vivian slept in hers, Tony made a decision that would shatter multiple lives. He would win his children back, would prove he could be a father, would earn a place in their world, even if Sandra hated him for it. The fact that this was about filling the void in his own life rather than serving their needs never occurred to him. Or if it did, he pushed the thought away as inconvenient truth. Tony Nelson had seen what he was missing, and he had never been taught how to let go of things he wanted, even things that had never been his to claim. Chapter 5. The Invasion. Tony began appearing everywhere Sandra went. A ghost that wouldn't stay buried, a presence that infected her safe spaces with anxiety and rage. At the grocery store, he materialized in the produce section, offering to reach items on high shelves when her arms were full of children and groceries. At the beach, he built sandcastles near where Caspian played, his expensive clothes ridiculous against the sand, his awkwardness with children painfully obvious. This is harassment. Sandra confronted him after the third incident, her voice low so the children wouldn't hear. "You're stalking us, Tony. Leave us alone or I'll call the police." "I'm in a public place." His response was calm, practiced, probably vetted by lawyers. "I'm not threatening you. I'm not approaching the children without permission. I'm just existing in the same town." "Why?" Sandra demanded, her control fracturing. "Why now? Why show up after 3 years of silence and think you have any right to disrupt our lives?" Tony's face cracked, genuine emotion breaking through the corporate mask. "Because I made the worst mistake of my life. Because I see them, and I see everything I threw away. Because I want to know my children, Sandra. I want a chance to be their father." "You're not their father." The words came out vicious, designed to wound. "You're a sperm donor who tried to pay me to abort them. Biology doesn't make you a parent. Showing up doesn't erase 3 years of abandonment." "I know that." Tony's hands clenched at his sides. "I know I have no rights here. I know I destroyed any claim when I gave you that check. But I'm asking for grace, Sandra. I'm asking for a chance to prove I'm different than the man who hurt you." Sandra wanted to laugh at his audacity. His assumption that he could show up and demand forgiveness, that his regret somehow entitled him to access. "You don't get to decide when you're ready to be a father. Tony, you don't get to discard them when they're inconvenient, and then claim them when you're having some midlife crisis about meaning and legacy." "It's not about legacy." Tony stepped closer, and Sandra instinctively moved back. "It's about them. About seeing Lorelei's determination, Amelie's talent, Caspian's kindness, and knowing that I helped create something beautiful. And I walked away from it. Let me prove I can be what they need. Let me try." The sincerity in his voice was almost convincing, almost enough to crack her defenses. But Sandra had survived by trusting her instincts, and every instinct screamed that letting Tony into their lives would end in disaster. "No." She gathered Lorelei and Amelie, called for Caspian. "Stay away from us, Tony. Go back to your wife, your company, your perfect life. We don't need you." But he kept coming back, kept showing up, kept pushing against her boundaries with the relentless determination of someone who had never been told no and actually accepted it. He brought expensive toys that the children were too young to appreciate, offered to pay for things Sandra explicitly refused, talked about opportunities his money could provide while completely missing that they didn't need his wealth. They needed stability. Rosalind watched this campaign with troubled eyes. seeing both Tony's desperation and Sandra's rigid fury, wondering if stubbornness was serving anyone or just satisfying the need for revenge. He's trying, Sandra. I'm not saying forgive him. I'm not saying trust him. But maybe let him prove himself before you cut him off completely. He'll leave again. Sandra's voice was flat, certain. He'll realize how hard this actually is, how boring and exhausting and thankless parenting can be, and he'll go back to his empire and his important meetings. I'm protecting them from that disappointment. Or you're punishing him by using them as weapons. Rosalind's words were gentle but sharp. I see what he did to you, baby. I see the damage. But those children deserve to know their father if he's genuinely trying to be present. Sandra wanted to argue, but doubt had started creeping in. Small questions about whether her protection was actually fear, whether keeping Tony away served her children or just satisfied her need for control. The breaking point came suddenly, violently, on a day that started normally and became a nightmare. Emily spiked a fever that climbed so fast, Sandra barely had time to panic before they were rushing to the emergency room. The child's small body burned like she was on fire, her eyes unfocused, her breathing shallow, and Sandra drove with Lorelei and Caspian screaming in the back seat, terror making her hands shake on the wheel. Tony was there, had apparently been following them to the park, and he saw their frantic departure and followed. Sandra wanted to tell him to leave, to stay out of this crisis. But Amelie was being rushed inside, and Lorelei and Caspian were dissolving into panic, and she couldn't manage everything at once. Let me help. Tony's voice was steady, calm in the chaos. Bah, let me take care of them while you focus on Amelie. Sandra should have refused, should have handled it alone the way she had handled everything for 3 years. But she was terrified and exhausted, and her daughter's life might be in danger. So she nodded. For 6 hours, Tony sat in the waiting room with Lorelei and Caspian, reading them stories from books he bought in the gift shop, distracting them with games and snacks, answering their frightened questions about their sister with reassurances he had no right to make, but that somehow helped. Sandra checked on them between updates from doctors, seeing her children curled against this stranger, accepting his comfort with the easy trust of children who didn't know about betrayal. When the doctors finally stabilized Amelie and released her with antibiotics for a severe infection, Sandra found Lorelei and Caspian asleep in Tony's arms, his expensive suit covered in chocolate stains and tears, his face exhausted but peaceful in a way she had never seen. Thank you. The words cost her something, an admission that he had helped, that he could be useful, that maybe he wasn't entirely the monster she had built him into. Tony looked up at her, careful not to wake the sleeping children. Can we talk? Just 5 minutes, please. Sandra was too tired to fight, too emotionally wrecked to maintain her walls, so she sat down, keeping distance between them, waiting for whatever he wanted to say. I was wrong. Tony's voice was rough, raw. About everything. About you, about the children, about what mattered. I don't expect you to forgive me, Sandra. I don't even expect you to believe that I've changed. But I'm asking for a chance to prove it, to show you that I'm serious about being their father, that this isn't some temporary guilt or midlife crisis. Why should I believe you won't leave again? Sandra's exhaustion made her honest. Why should I risk their hearts on your redemption arc? Because I have nothing else. Tony's confession was devastating in its simplicity. My marriage is a business arrangement. My career feels empty. My entire life is a performance for people whose approval means nothing. Those children are the only real thing I've ever created, and I threw them away because I was too much of a coward to choose authenticity over expectation. Let me prove I'm different now. Let me try to be what they need. Sandra looked at him, really looked, and saw something she hadn't expected. Genuine regret, yes, but underneath it was transformation, the kind that comes from facing who you were and hating what you see. She thought about her children sleeping in his arms, about how Caspian had stopped crying when Tony told him stories, about how even Lorelei had relaxed into his presence. Supervised visits, the words came out before she fully decided. Twice a week at my house with me present. You follow my rules completely. You don't make promises you can't keep. You don't bring expensive gifts. You don't talk about your money or what you can provide. You just show up, be present, and we'll see if you can actually do this." Tony's face transformed, hope lighting features that had been carved with grief. "I won't let you down." "You already have." Sandra's voice was hard, protecting herself from the vulnerability of this choice. "This is about them, not you. The moment you prove me right about you being temporary, you're gone forever. Understand?" "I understand." Sandra didn't believe him, didn't trust him, but she was too tired to fight anymore, too aware that maybe keeping them apart was serving her anger more than their well-being. She had made her choice, opened a door she couldn't easily close, and now she would have to live with whatever came next, whether it was healing or just a new way to break. Chapter 6. The Cracks. Tony's first official visit was excruciating for everyone involved. The triplets treating him like a dangerous intruder, Sandra hovering like a hawk protecting her nest. Tony himself fumbling through every interaction with painful awkwardness. He arrived exactly on time with nothing but himself, following Sandra's rules to the letter, and sat on the floor where she directed him, waiting for the children to decide if he was worth their attention. Lorelei approached first, her boldness masking suspicion, standing directly in front of him with her hands on her hips. "Mama says you want to know us. Why didn't you want to know us before?" The question was brutal in its simplicity, and Tony had no good answer. Nothing that would make sense to a child, no way to explain cowardice and fear and choosing safety over courage. "I made a terrible mistake. I was scared of being a father because I thought I wouldn't be good at it. I was wrong to let fear make my decisions." "Are you still scared?" Lorelei's eyes were relentless, demanding truth. Terrified, Tony's honesty seemed to satisfy her more than a comfortable lie would have. "But I'm trying anyway." Amelie ignored him completely, sitting in her corner with her drawing supplies, occasionally glancing up to study him like he was a puzzle she was trying to solve. Her silence was more unnerving than Lorelei's interrogation. Her judgment withheld but absolute. Caspian was the one who broke the standoff, climbing into Tony's lap after 20 minutes with the easy affection of a child who loved indiscriminately. "Do you want to see my dinosaurs? They have names and stories and everything." Tony felt something crack open in his chest as Caspian settled against him, small and warm and trusting in ways Tony didn't deserve. The child launched into complicated explanations about his toy collection, assigning elaborate mythologies to plastic figures, and Tony listened with an intensity that had nothing to do with dinosaurs and everything to do with drinking in every detail of this person he had helped create. The visits became routine over the following months. Tony showing up exactly when promised, never pushing for more than Sandra allowed, slowly earning microscopic increments of trust. He learned that Lorelei needed logical explanations and firm boundaries, that she respected honesty even when it was uncomfortable. He discovered that Amélie responded to art supplies and quiet presence, that she would gradually warm if he didn't push, if he let her set the pace. Caspian was the easiest and the hardest, eager for connection, but also sensitive enough to pick up on every tension between the adults. His joy dimming when Sandra and Tony exchanged sharp words or loaded silences. Tony started bringing sketch paper for Amélie, chapter books for Lorelei, patience for Caspian, learning their languages slowly and imperfectly. He made constant mistakes, panicking when they cried, not understanding why a broken cracker could cause a meltdown, struggling with the chaos and noise and irrational demands of small humans. Sandra watched him fail repeatedly, waiting for him to give up, to realize this was too hard. But he kept coming back, kept trying, kept asking how to do better. Something unexpected was happening, though, something Sandra hadn't anticipated. Tony was changing in ways that seemed to terrify him, his carefully constructed life crumbling as his priorities shifted without permission. He started leaving work early, missing meetings, letting calls go to voicemail during visits. And the corporate warrior who had once chosen empire over everything was suddenly choosing differently. His father noticed and disapproved, showing up at Tony's office with lectures about responsibility and legacy that used to motivate, but now just sounded hollow. "You're throwing away everything I built for some children who aren't even raised properly. Their mother is working class, Tony. They'll never fit into our world." "Maybe I don't want them in our world." Tony's response shocked them both. "Maybe our world is poison, and I'd rather they grow up normal than twisted." The relationship between father and son fractured that day, revealing foundations that had always been conditional, love that was actually transaction disguised as family. Tony walked out of that office understanding that he had spent his entire life chasing approval from someone incapable of giving it. Vivian noticed the changes too, their already dead marriage becoming purely performative. She confronted him in their cavernous apartment, her face cold and beautiful and carved from ice. "I know about the children. I've always known you were keeping secrets. I don't care, Tony, as long as you're discreet and don't embarrass the family name." "I'm done being discreet." Tony's words were not planned, but felt inevitable. "I'm done pretending this marriage is anything but a contract. I'm done living a lie." Vivian's laugh was sharp and cruel. "You think you're going to play house with your working-class girlfriend and her children? You think you'll be happy in some small town, pretending to be normal? You'll hate it within a year. You'll miss the power, the influence, the life you're throwing away for some fantasy? Maybe." Tony met her eyes without flinching. "But at least it will be real." He filed for divorce with terms so generous that Vivian's lawyers couldn't believe their fortune. Tony was bleeding his accounts dry, setting her up to maintain her lifestyle without him, essentially paying for his freedom. His father threatened to disown him, to remove him from the company, to destroy his reputation. But Tony discovered he didn't care about threats anymore, didn't care about legacy or inheritance or anything except earning a place in his children's lives. Sandra watched these upheavals with deep suspicion. Certain this was temporary insanity, convinced Tony would wake up one day and regret burning down his life for children he barely knew. Her aunt kept telling her to give him credit, to acknowledge that destroying your entire existence proved commitment. But Sandra had been betrayed too thoroughly to believe in transformation. Then Vivian showed up at Sandra's door, elegant and furious and crackling with malice. "I know what you're doing. Seducing my husband with your children, playing on his guilt to trap him into playing father. It's pathetic and it's going to stop." Sandra stood in her doorway, deliberately not inviting this woman inside, recognizing the threat immediately. "Tony made his own choices. I never asked him to come back. I never wanted him in our lives." "I don't believe you." Vivian's eyes were cold, calculating. "Women like you see men like Tony and see dollar signs, opportunity, a way out of your little poverty existence. But let me be very clear. If you continue this arrangement, if you keep allowing him to play house with your children, I will make your life a nightmare. I have resources you can't imagine, connections that will bury you, and I will paint you as a gold digger who trapped a married man. Get off my property." Sandra's voice was steady despite the rage shaking her bones. "Whatever issues you have are with Tony, not with me. I didn't destroy your marriage. He did that himself." Vivian left with a final warning, and Sandra stood there shaking, understanding that she had been naive to think they could exist outside Tony's toxic world, that his sphere of influence extended further than she had imagined. When Tony arrived for his next scheduled visit, Sandra met him outside, not letting him in, her face hard with decision. "This needs to stop. Your wife was here making threats. Your father probably hates us. Your whole world is falling apart because you suddenly decided you want to be a father. I can't do this, Tony. I can't be responsible for destroying your life." "You're not destroying anything." Tony's face was desperate, frightened. "I'm finally building something real. Let me prove it, Sandra. Let me show you this isn't temporary. No, the word was final, absolute. Go back to your wife, work things out with your father, save your company. The children are getting attached, and when you inevitably leave, it will devastate them. I'm protecting them from that pain. I'm not leaving. Tony's voice cracked. I'm divorcing Vivian. I've stepped back from the company. I'm moving here permanently. I'm doing everything you said I wouldn't do, everything that proves I'm serious. You're having a breakdown. Sandra's words were cruel, but necessary. You're going to regret this, Tony. You're going to wake up one day and resent me for letting you throw your life away. I won't do that to you or to my children. This was a mistake. We're done. She walked inside and closed the door, leaving Tony standing on her porch, understanding that she had made her decision, that her walls were back up and reinforced, that saving them from future pain meant causing present pain. And maybe she was right, but it didn't make it hurt any less. Chapter 7. The Rupture. Tony refused to accept Sandra's decision, showing up at her house every day, despite explicit instructions to stay away, leaving notes when she wouldn't answer the door, calling from different numbers when she blocked his phone. His desperation was suffocating, his inability to accept rejection, proving exactly what Sandra feared about entitled men who had never been told no. You're harassing us. Sandra finally confronted him on her porch, fury overriding fear. Leave, Tony. Leave us alone, or I'm filing for a restraining order. I'll fight you in court then. Tony's mask finally slipped, revealing the ruthless corporate warrior underneath the reformed father act. I have rights, Sandra. I'm their biological father. I can demand paternity tests, force custody arrangements, make your life hell through legal channels you can't afford to fight. There it is. Sandra's laugh was bitter, vindicated. The real Tony Nelson, threatening to use his wealth and power to take what he wants because he's never learned how to accept losing. This is why I said no, Tony, because I knew the mask would fall eventually. Tony's face crumbled, horror replacing anger. I didn't mean that. I'm just terrified of losing them, of losing this chance. Please, Sandra. I'll do anything. You can't buy your way into our lives. Sandra's voice was ice. You can't threaten your way in either. You had 3 months to prove you were different, and at the first real obstacle, you showed me exactly who you are. We're done. Stay away from my children. She went inside and locked the door, listening to him pound and plead and finally leave, his car engine fading into distance. Sandra slid down the wall, exhausted and vindicated and heartbroken all at once. Knowing she had been right not to trust him, knowing she had saved her children from future devastation, hating how much it hurt anyway. The children sensed the shift immediately, asking where Mr. Tony was, why he didn't visit anymore, if they had done something to make him leave. Sandra tried to explain that sometimes adults made things complicated, that it wasn't their fault, that they were loved and safe, but her explanations felt hollow even to herself. Lorelei became aggressive at preschool, pushing other children when they got too close, testing every boundary with violent determination. And Millie stopped drawing for a week, just sat in her corner staring at nothing, her silence more terrifying than any tantrum. Caspian cried every night, calling for Mr. Tony with a desperation that shattered Sandra's heart into smaller and smaller pieces. You're hurting them to punish him. Rosalind didn't hide her disappointment. I watched him, Sandra. I saw genuine change. I saw a man facing his demons and trying to be better. You cut him off at the first sign of weakness, instead of letting him prove he could recover from mistakes. He threatened to take them from me. Sandra's voice was hollow. He showed his true colors. I was protecting them. You were protecting yourself. Rosalind's words were gentle but devastating. From the possibility that he might be real, that you might have to forgive him, that your anger has been the shield keeping you safe, and without it, you'd have to risk getting hurt again. Sandra wanted to argue but couldn't find words, just sat with her aunt's accusation, wondering if stubbornness and self-protection had become indistinguishable, if her walls were keeping danger out or just keeping love locked inside with nowhere to go. Tony was destroying his life with methodical precision, burning every bridge, severing every tie to his old existence. The divorce from Vivian finalized with shocking speed. Her lawyers thrilled by the settlement that left her wealthy and free. His father showed up at his apartment with final ultimatums, demanding Tony end this madness and return to his responsibilities. But Tony told him to leave and never come back, understanding that some relationships were poison disguised as family. He bought a small house 3 blocks from Sandra's rental, sold most of his possessions, started a consulting business that gave him flexibility and independence, but nothing like his previous wealth or power. His former colleagues whispered about his breakdown. His friends stopped calling. His entire social circle evaporated like morning fog when he stepped outside the protection of his family name. Tony prepared for a life he didn't know how to live, alone with his choices and his regrets, watching Sandra and the children from a distance like a ghost observing the living. He saw them at the beach, at the grocery store, at the park, always careful to stay far enough away that she couldn't accuse him of harassment, close enough that he could see their faces, hear their laughter, witness the life he had chosen too late to join. Vivian sent him a letter through her lawyer, cold and cutting, telling him he had thrown away everything real for a fantasy, that he would regret choosing poverty and mediocrity over the life they had built together, that he was a fool who deserved the obscurity waiting for him. Tony read it and felt nothing, just relief that he was free from a performance that had been slowly suffocating him. His mother, Dorothy, called, her voice heavy with grief and understanding. "Your father is wrong about this, Tony. He's been wrong about most things, forcing you to live his unlived life instead of your own. I wish I had been stronger when you were young. Wish I had protected you from his demands. Do what you need to do, baby. Chase what's real, even if it costs you everything." Her blessing meant everything and nothing, validation coming too late to undo decades of damage. Tony understood that he was fundamentally broken, that his father's conditioning had warped him into someone who valued appearance over substance, who chose comfort over courage, who destroyed love because admitting he wanted it felt like weakness. The months passed slowly. Painfully, Tony existing in his small house, doing his consulting work, watching his children grow from a distance, while their mother rebuilt the walls he had briefly breached. He wrote letters to Lorelei, Amelie, and Caspian that he never sent, apologies and explanations and love confessions that would sit in a drawer until they were old enough to maybe understand. He had given up everything for a chance at redemption, had burned his entire life down for the possibility of earning forgiveness. And Sandra had rejected him anyway, had proven that some betrayals were too deep to heal, that wanting to change wasn't the same as deserving absolution. Late one night, unable to sleep, Tony walked to the beach where he had played with Caspian months ago, sitting in the sand and staring at an ocean that offered no answers. He was so lost in grief that he didn't notice Sandra approaching until she was there, sitting beside him with enough distance that they weren't touching, both of them existing in silence while waves crashed and retreated, nature's demonstration that some things were inevitable cycles. "I'm leaving." Tony's voice was rough, defeated. "Moving back to the city. Not because I'm giving up, but because staying here is hurting you, trapping you in the past, preventing you from moving forward. I've set up trust funds for all 3 children. I've signed papers giving you full custody with no interference from me. I've written them letters explaining everything, apologizing for everything, hoping they'll understand one day that my absence is love, not abandonment." Sandra listened to this goodbye and felt something unexpected crack inside her chest. Not relief, but grief. The satisfaction she thought she would feel at his departure, replaced by a loss she didn't want to examine. "Why are you really leaving?" "Because I love them too much to keep hurting them." Tony's confession was raw and honest. "Because every time Caspian cries for me, every time Lorelei asks why I left, every time Amelie's drawings get darker, I'm reminded that I'm causing damage just by existing in their orbit. You were right about me, Sandra. I'm not capable of being what they need. Walking away is the only decent thing I can do." Sandra looked at him, really looked, seeing exhaustion and devastation and genuine transformation carved into features that used to be arrogant and cold. She thought about her children asking for him, about how their joy had increased when he was present, about the difference between protecting them from disappointment and teaching them that people could change, that second chances weren't always naive, that forgiveness required courage. "Stay." The word came out before she fully decided. "Not because I forgive you, not because I trust you, but because they need to know their father, and you're trying to be him. Real trying, not performance. If you're serious about this, prove it. Not with grand gestures or sacrifices, but with consistency. Show up when it's boring, when it's hard, when there's no reward except their presence. Earn your place one day at a time." Tony's face transformed, hope and terror mixing into something desperate and fragile. "I won't disappoint you again." "You already have." Sandra's voice was hard, protecting herself from the vulnerability of this choice. "The question is whether you'll keep disappointing or whether you'll actually become someone worthy of their love. I guess we're about to find out." Chapter 8. The test. Tony moved into the small house 3 blocks away. This proximity both comfort and constant reminder of how fragile his second chance was. Sandra's new rules were brutal in their specificity. Scheduled visits with rigid time limits. No spontaneous drop-ins. No gifts without explicit permission. No promises to the children that hadn't been vetted and approved. Essentially putting him on permanent probation where one mistake meant exile. He accepted every condition without argument, understanding that trust had to be measured in millimeters, earned through relentless consistency rather than dramatic gestures. The triplets' reaction to his return was complicated in ways that broke his heart. Lorelei was suspicious and withholding, making him work for every smile, every conversation, every acknowledgement that he existed. Emily was cautiously warming, allowing him into her space incrementally, testing whether he would stay this time or disappear again when things got difficult. Caspian was immediately attached, crawling into Tony's lap the moment he arrived, like no time had passed. His forgiveness instantaneous and terrifying in its completeness. Tony showed up exactly when Sandra said he could, stayed exactly as long as permitted, followed every rule with such careful precision that it sometimes felt absurd. But he understood that reliability was the foundation everything else would be built on. He learned to navigate meltdowns without panicking, to cook meals they would actually eat instead of what he thought they should eat, to set boundaries when they pushed instead of giving in to avoid conflict. He was terrible at first, bribing them with sugar when he should have been firm, saying yes to everything because he was terrified of them hating him, making mistakes that Sandra corrected with sharp words and barely concealed frustration. But he learned from every failure, asked questions without defensiveness, accepted criticism as the price of admission. Sandra watched this transformation with guarded hope, waiting for the moment when Tony would realize how hard parenting actually was and retreat to easier options. But months passed and he kept showing up, kept trying, kept choosing them even when visits were boring or exhausting or thankless, even when there was no reward except their presence. Rosalind became Tony's unexpected ally, teaching him recipes the children loved, explaining their personalities in ways that helped him understand their needs, giving him wisdom about patience and persistence that his own parents had never offered. The house 3 blocks away slowly transformed into a second home for the triplets, filled with their drawings and toys and evidence of existence. Tony's formerly pristine space becoming beautifully chaotic. Sandra found herself softening incrementally, allowing longer visits, trusting him with solo time while she ran errands, seeing him as a partner rather than a threat. They developed a co-parenting relationship that was professional and distant but functional, both of them prioritizing the children's needs over their complicated feelings. both of them careful not to acknowledge the attraction that occasionally flickered between them like a dangerous spark. Then Tony's father died suddenly, a massive heart attack that killed him before the ambulance arrived, and Tony had to return to the city for the funeral. He asked Sandra if he could take the children with him to meet their family, to understand where they came from, even if that history was complicated. Sandra's instinct was to refuse, to keep them away from the toxicity of Tony's world. But she saw genuine grief in his eyes, mixed with a desire to share something real with them. So she agreed to a weekend trip with strict conditions about supervision and safety. The city felt different to Sandra this time, less threatening now that she had built a life beyond it, less capable of defining her worth. Tony's family home was exactly what she expected, massive and cold and full of expensive things that weren't meant to be touched. Museum perfect and utterly lifeless. Dorothy was a revelation, though. A woman who had spent her life in her husband's shadow, but emerged after his death with surprising warmth and strength. She looked at the triplets with immediate love, her eyes filling with tears as she knelt to their level, touching their faces like she was confirming they were real. "I've been waiting to meet you." Dorothy's voice was soft, full of wonder. "I've been hoping my son would do the right thing, and here you are. Here you finally are." She had prepared rooms for them, filled with age-appropriate toys and books, evidence that she had been planning for this moment, hoping for this chance. Sandra watched this elegant white woman embrace her children without hesitation or judgment, recognizing that not all of Tony's family was poison, that some branches had survived the toxic soil. The funeral was difficult. Tony facing family members who whispered about his divorce and his children, their judgment obvious, even when they tried to hide it. But Dorothy stood beside him with fierce pride, introduced the triplets as her grandchildren without qualification or apology, her defiance making clear that anyone who had a problem could leave. Sandra saw Tony in the context of his family's damage and understood things she hadn't before, how his father's cruelty had shaped him, how his mother's weakness had failed to protect him, how he had been trained from birth to value appearance over authenticity. The knowledge didn't erase his betrayal, but added context, complicated the narrative she had been telling herself about his character. On the last night, after the children were asleep in their temporary rooms, Tony and Sandra sat in the library where he had once offered her money to erase their existence. The symmetry wasn't lost on either of them, this full-circle moment heavy with meaning and unspoken emotions. "My father died hating me." Tony's voice was hollow. His last words were about how I had destroyed his legacy, thrown away everything he built for children who would never be accepted in his world. He died angry that I chose love over duty. "I'm sorry." Sandra meant it, recognizing that complicated grief was still grief, that losing a parent you had a difficult relationship with carried its own specific pain. "I'm not." Tony's confession was quiet but certain. His death released me from the last chain, the final obligation. "I'm finally free to just be myself, whoever that is." Sandra looked at him, seeing exhaustion and relief, and something that might have been peace, understanding that transformation was possible even for people raised in toxicity, that choosing to be different than your parents was its own form of courage. "You've done well with them." The admission cost her something. "The children love you, Tony, not as an idea or because of what you can provide, but because you show up, because you're present, because you're trying to be what they need." "I'm trying to be what you taught me they needed." Tony met her eyes. "You're an incredible mother, Sandra. You saved them when I tried to destroy them. You built a life for them when I offered you nothing. Everything good in them comes from you." The moment stretched between them, loaded with things neither was ready to say, both of them aware that something was shifting, that whatever this co-parenting arrangement had become was evolving into something more complicated and dangerous. Tony leaned forward, his intention clear, giving Sandra time to pull away, to stop this before it started. She should have retreated, should have maintained her boundaries, should have remembered that mixing passion with their fragile partnership could destroy everything. Instead, she kissed him, fierce and desperate and full of 3 years of rage and grief and unwanted longing. Tony responded with equal intensity, his hands in her hair, their bodies remembering what their minds had tried to forget. Passion and pain so tangled they were indistinguishable. Sandra pulled away first, gasping, horrified at herself, understanding that she had just complicated everything irreparably. This was a mistake. "I know." Tony's voice was rough, his eyes dark with want and confusion and fear. They sat in silence, both terrified of what had just happened, both knowing that crossing this line changed everything, neither ready to examine what it meant or where it led, the weight of their choices pressing down like physical force. Chapter 9. The Becoming. The kiss in the library became the earthquake neither of them acknowledged, but both felt constantly, shifting the ground beneath their carefully constructed co-parenting arrangement. Sandra retreated immediately after returning home, imposing distance again, terrified that her body's memory of loving him would override her brain's memory of betrayal, that physical desire would trick her into vulnerability. Tony respected her space, but started writing letters, old-fashioned handwritten pages that arrived daily, not asking for anything but just sharing thoughts, progress, fears, gratitude. He wrote about therapy sessions where he was unpacking his father's damage, about realizing he had been running from intimacy his entire life because vulnerability felt like weakness, about understanding that Sandra and the children represented everything real he had been conditioned to fear. Sandra read these letters late at night after the triplets were asleep, recognizing vulnerability and authenticity she had never seen in him before, watching through his words as he did the difficult work of actually changing instead of just performing change. Her walls began to crack incrementally, small fissures that let in light and possibility and terrifying hope. Dorothy became an unexpected presence in their lives, visiting monthly, showering the triplets with attention while respecting Sandra's authority, teaching them about their heritage and the responsibility that came with privilege. She apologized repeatedly for not protecting Tony from his father, for failing to give him the childhood he deserved, for standing by while he was molded into someone incapable of authentic connection. "I was weak when it mattered." Dorothy's confession was heavy with regret. "I let my husband destroy our son's capacity for love because I was too afraid to stand up to him. I can't undo that damage, but I can try to be present for my grandchildren, to give them what I failed to give Tony." Sandra found herself warming to this woman who had every reason to reject them, but instead embraced them with fierce devotion, who defied her own social circle to claim these mixed-race grandchildren as family, who proved that transformation was possible even for people raised in privilege and prejudice. Months passed with agonizing slowness. Each day, another test of whether Tony would maintain his consistency or revert to old patterns. He showed up for every scheduled visit, never missed a commitment, never made excuses when things got difficult. He learned to braid Lorelei's hair after weeks of YouTube tutorials, figured out how to soothe Amélie's anxiety without words, became Caspian's safe place when the world felt too big and scary. Lorelei started calling him Daddy 8 months after his return, not because anyone pushed her, but because she decided he had earned it. Her approval, the hardest one and most meaningful. The first time she used the word, Tony's face crumbled, tears streaming down his cheeks, his gratitude and disbelief so raw that Sandra had to look away from the intimacy of it. Amélie created a family portrait that included everyone, Sandra and Tony and all 3 children, and Aunt Rosalind and Grandmother Dorothy, a vision of family that existed in her imagination, but was slowly becoming real. She gave it to Tony during a visit, watching his face carefully to gauge his reaction. And when he hung it on his refrigerator with reverence, treating it like precious art, she smiled for the first time in his presence, Caspian told everyone at preschool about his daddy, who was lost but came back. A simple child's narrative that somehow captured the complexity better than any adult explanation. Teachers mentioned it to Sandra with concern, making sure she was safe, that this wasn't a dangerous situation. And Sandra found herself defending Tony, explaining that he was genuinely present, genuinely trying, genuinely transformed. Sandra watched her children fall in love with their father and felt her own resistance crumbling, understanding that forgiveness wasn't a single decision, but a series of choices, a daily practice of releasing resentment and choosing connection. Tony proved himself through consistency rather than grand gestures, showing up for doctor's appointments and preschool events and midnight crises, becoming the kind of father Sandra had once dreamed he could be, but never expected to actually see. One evening, after a particularly chaotic dinner where Amélie spilled juice everywhere, Caspian had a meltdown about bedtime routines, and Lorelei declared she hated everything. Tony helped Sandra clean the kitchen in comfortable silence. They worked around each other with practiced ease, their movements synchronized from months of shared parenting. And Sandra realized this felt like partnership, like family, like something she had given up believing was possible. "Thank you for giving me this chance." Tony's voice was quiet, careful not to break the moment's peace. "Thank you for believing I could change, even when I didn't believe it myself." Sandra looked at him. This man who had broken her and rebuilt himself, who had chosen them over everything else, who had learned that love was sacrifice and presence, and showing up even when it was boring and thankless. "You earned it, Tony. You're earning it every day." The kiss happened gradually this time, not explosive passion, but tender connection, both of them moving toward each other with intention and fear and hope. Tony cupped her face like she was something precious, his touch gentle and questioning, and Sandra leaned into it, accepting what she had been fighting for months. "I love you." Tony's confession was simple, no qualifications or conditions. "I never stopped loving you, Sandra. I was just too broken to know how to love you the right way. Let me try again. Let me show you I can be what you deserve." Sandra wanted to protect herself, to remind him of betrayal, to keep walls up for safety, but she was exhausted from fighting, tired of letting fear make her decisions. "If we do this, it's forever, Tony. No running when it gets hard, no choosing career over family, no going back to being the man who threw us away. Forever or nothing." Forever, Tony's promise was absolute. "I'll spend the rest of my life proving I mean it." They kissed again, deeper this time, 3 years of longing and rage and grief and hope tangled together. Both of them understanding they were choosing something terrifying and beautiful. Both of them ready to risk everything for the possibility of being whole. The proposal came months later, not in a restaurant or public spectacle, but in Sandra's kitchen after another chaotic dinner. Tony getting on his knee among the mess and chaos, holding a ring that was beautiful but not ostentatious. "Marry me." Not because the children need it, not because it makes sense practically, but because I love you, because you're my home, because I want to spend my life earning your trust and your love. Sandra looked at this man who had destroyed her and rebuilt himself, who had chosen them over empire, who had learned that love was work and sacrifice and showing up every single day. Yes. The wedding was small and intimate, just family and close friends on the beach where everything had begun to heal. Dorothy cried throughout the ceremony. Rosalind beamed with pride. The triplets served as chaotic wedding party members who stole every moment and made everything perfect in their imperfection. Tony adopted all 3 children legally, making official what had become true through time and effort and relentless consistency. Lorelei Nelson, Amélie Nelson, Caspian Nelson, 3 children born from betrayal who became proof that transformation was possible, that forgiveness could heal wounds that should have been fatal. Sandra kept her name as Astilla Nelson, a hyphenation that represented her refusal to be absorbed, her insistence on maintaining identity within partnership. They bought a house together, merged their lives, became partners and lovers and parents, building something real from the ruins of what had been destroyed. The children grew up knowing their story, the difficult parts and the healing parts, understanding that their father had failed but chose to become better, that their mother's strength had saved them all. That family was something you chose every day, through action, rather than just biology. Years later, Sandra would look at her family and remember that check on the glass table, those 6 zeros that were supposed to erase them, and feel gratitude for her younger self who chose courage, who believed 3 heartbeats were worth fighting for when the world said they weren't. Chapter 10. The Proof. The ocean stretched endlessly before them, waves catching afternoon sun and transforming water into liquid gold that seemed to pour straight from the sky. Sandra stood with Tony's arm around her waist, watching their 5-year-old triplets play in the surf with fearless joy, their laughter carrying on salt-tinged wind that smelled of freedom and second chances. Lorelei was building an elaborate sandcastle, ordering her siblings around with the confidence of someone who knew her own mind completely, her voice carrying authority that made Sandra smile because that fierceness came directly from her, from survival, from refusing to be diminished. Emily collected shells with artistic precision, arranging them in patterns only she understood, her concentration absolute as she created beauty from scattered fragments. Caspian chased waves with abandon, shrieking with delight when water caught his feet, his joy infectious and pure and uncomplicated by the weight of history that his parents carried. "I never thought this was possible." Tony's voice was quiet, reverent, thick with emotions he no longer tried to hide. "I thought I had destroyed any chance at this kind of happiness. I thought that check, those words, that moment in the penthouse, had sealed my fate as someone who would never deserve this." Sandra leaned into him, comfortable in his presence in ways she never imagined feeling again after that night when her world shattered. "You almost did. You came within a breath of losing everything that mattered. If you had pushed one day longer, if you had made one more threat, if you had shown up with lawyers instead of humility, we wouldn't be here." "I know." Tony kissed her temple, his gratitude evident in every gesture, every touch, every moment he held her like she was something precious he couldn't believe he was allowed to keep. "And Sane sedele tane totin. Thank you for giving me a chance to be worthy of you, of them. Thank you for seeing past who I was to who I could become. Thank you for being brave enough to risk your heart again when I had already broken it once." Dorothy appeared beside them, her own eyes wet watching her grandchildren play, her transformation from society matron to devoted grandmother, complete and beautiful in its authenticity. She had sold the mansion after her husband's funeral, donated half his fortune to causes he would have hated, and rebuilt her life around what actually mattered instead of what looked impressive. She visited every month now, stayed in the guest room that Lorelei had decorated with crayon drawings, read bedtime stories with voices that made the children giggle, and loved with the intensity of someone making up for lost time. "They're beautiful, both of you." Dorothy's voice carried wonder and pride. "You built something extraordinary from very broken pieces. You took devastation and turned it into this, into them, into a family that shouldn't exist but does because you both refused to give up." Sandra smiled, recognizing truth in those words, feeling the weight of their journey settle into something lighter, something that felt less like burden and more like triumph. Their family was unconventional, born from betrayal and rebuilt through forgiveness, messy and imperfect and absolutely real in ways that polished perfection could never achieve. Tony had done the brutal work of transformation, had faced his demons and changed fundamentally, had torn down everything he thought defined him to discover who he actually was underneath the performance. But Sandra had done equally hard work, learning to trust again after trust was shattered, to forgive without forgetting, to allow love after devastation had taught her that love was dangerous. Rosalind joined them, her presence solid and comforting, carrying the beach bag filled with towels and snacks and all the practical things that made family outings possible. She had been their anchor through every storm, the one who held them together when they were falling apart, who believed in second chances when Sandra wanted to build walls forever. She caught Sandra's eye and smiled, that knowing smile that said she had always known this was how the story would end, that love was more powerful than hurt when people were willing to do the work. Caspian ran toward them suddenly, dripping wet and covered in sand, launching himself into Tony's arms with complete confidence that he would be caught, that his father would always be there to catch him. Tony held him close, pressing kisses to wet curls, his love uncomplicated and absolute, his gratitude for this trust evident in the way his hands trembled slightly as he held his son. Lorelei followed, demanding attention with the imperious tone of someone who knew she was adored, wanting her parents to see her architectural achievement, to witness her creation. Emily came last, clutching shells she wanted to show her mother, her quiet voice describing the patterns she saw, the stories each shell contained, the universe she found in small, beautiful things. Sandra gathered them all close, her heart full enough to hurt, understanding that this moment was what she had fought for during those desperate early days when she didn't know how she would survive, what she had chosen when she walked away from Tony's check, what she had built through exhaustion and determination and refusal to let his rejection define their worth. "Tell us the story again, Bummer," Lorelei demanded, nestled against Sandra's side. "The one about when we were born." Sandra exchanged glances with Tony, seeing the same mix of pain and joy reflected in his eyes, both of them understanding that their children deserved truth, even uncomfortable truth. "You were born during a storm," Sandra began, her voice soft but steady. "The rain was falling so hard it sounded like music, and I was scared because you came early, because I didn't know if I was strong enough to be your mother. But you were strong." Amelie's voice was certain, absolute. "You're the strongest person in the world." "I had to be." Sandra kissed the top of her daughter's head. "Because you three were worth being strong for. You were worth everything I gave up, everything I survived, everything I fought through. You were worth choosing when the world said I should choose differently." Tony's arm tightened around her waist, his silent acknowledgement of the pain he had caused. The choice he had tried to steal from her, the future he had almost destroyed. The children didn't need to know those details yet, didn't need to carry the weight of their father's worst moment. But someday they would know the whole story, and Sandra trusted they would understand that people could change, that transformation was real, that forgiveness was possible even after devastating betrayal. "I love you," Tony whispered it like prayer. Like promise, like the most important truth he had ever spoken. "All of you, completely, forever, with everything I am and everything I'm still becoming." Sandra looked at him, this man who had been her greatest pain and was now her deepest joy, who had destroyed her, and then spent years rebuilding both of them with patience and humility and relentless consistency. She saw the grey threading through his hair, the lines around his eyes from laughing with their children, the softness in his expression that came from finally living authentically instead of performing for audiences who didn't matter. He was beautiful in his imperfection, in his hard-won transformation, in his daily choice to be present even when presence was difficult. "We love you too." Sandra's voice was steady, certain, carrying none of the hesitation that used to color every interaction. "Forever and always, through whatever comes next, through every challenge and every joy. We're a family, Tony, not because biology made us one, but because we chose each other, because we built this through blood and tears and refusing to give up on what mattered." The sun began setting, painting the sky in colors that defied description, deep purples bleeding into oranges and pinks and golds that looked like the universe was celebrating with them. Sandra understood in her bones that this wasn't a fairy tale ending, but a real beginning, the start of building a life rather than the conclusion of a story. There would be hard days ahead, challenges and conflicts, and moments when old wounds reopened just to remind them they existed. But they would face everything together, as partners, as family, as people who had learned that love was a choice made daily, rather than a feeling that sustained itself without effort. The triplets ran back to the water, their voices blending with waves, their joy uncomplicated and perfect, and everything Sandra had fought to give them. She followed, pulling Tony with her, Rosalind and Dorothy joining them. All of them walking into the surf together, their laughter rising above the sound of waves, their family expanding to hold everyone who chose love over judgment, presence over perfection. Sandra looked back at the beach behind them, at the footprints they had left in the sand. Evidence of their presence, proof of their existence, marks that would be washed away by the tide, but would be made again tomorrow and the day after that, and every day they chose to show up. She thought about the girl who had walked out of that penthouse office with nothing but heartbreak and determination, who had chosen life when erasure would have been easier, who had built miracles from devastation. "Thank you." Tony's voice was rough with emotion, his eyes on their children playing in the golden light. "For not giving up on me when I had already given up on myself. For seeing something worth saving when I thought I was beyond redemption. For teaching me that love isn't about perfection, it's about showing up. It's about choosing someone even when they don't deserve it. It's about building something beautiful from broken pieces." Sandra turned to face him fully, water swirling around their legs, the sunset painting them both in shades of gold and possibility. "You taught me something too, that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, but it does mean releasing the weight of anger, because carrying it was destroying me. That transformation is possible when someone is willing to do the brutal work of changing. That second chances are terrifying and beautiful, and sometimes the bravest thing we can do." They kissed, soft and sweet and full of promise, while their children played nearby and the people who loved them watched with tears and smiles, all of them bearing witness to this family that shouldn't exist but does, that was born from the worst betrayal and became the most beautiful redemption. This was their proof that transformation was possible, that forgiveness could heal wounds that should have been fatal, that some mistakes became the foundation for something stronger than what existed before. Not perfect, but real. Not easy, but worth every difficult moment, every tear shed, every wall torn down, every choice to be vulnerable when safety would have been simpler. Not the end, but the beginning of everything that mattered, everything that was worth fighting for, everything that made life more than just survival, but actually worth living. The waves kept coming, steady and eternal, and Sandra understood that their love would be like that, constant through storms and calm alike, present through devastation and joy, choosing each other every single day until the last breath left their bodies and beyond, into whatever came next, forever and always, exactly as they had promised.